AMD's R9 7950X3D do be looking a little sus, and we'll talk about why, but it's actually really interesting. So there's a 3D V-cache CPU. That means they've taken a massive amount of L3 cache and they've physically stacked it on top of one of the CCDs in the CPU. So it follows up the wildly successful 5800X3D, which was powerful enough that it sort of stole sales from AMD's own follow-up in the 7000 series. And now they're bringing X3D to the new 7000 series as well. So X3D is super interesting because in gaming specifically, it helps a lot. But the way it's oriented on the 7950X3D actually means turning off half the cores yields far better performance. We'll show you that today in this in-depth review and explanation of how it behaves and how the V-cache is arranged on this as opposed to the previous 5800X3D. So pricing is $700 for the 7950X3D. Very expensive, obviously. It's at the highest end for desktop CPUs, followed by the 7900X3D, which is a $600 part, and that one is followed by the $450 7800X3D, which is being held until April. Let's get started. Before that, this video is brought to you by Lian Li's O11D Evo case. The O11D Evo is a mid-tower that tested well previously with us and is most interesting for attention to fine details and its unique features. One of those is the easy-to-use invertible layout. The O11D Evo inversion process is the easiest we've ever worked with on a case, allowing it to flip entirely for a unique upside-down build or work as a standard layout. The O11D Evo has 2 chambers for the system and the power supply, support for up to 9 storage drives, and edge-to-edge glass for a showcase, while still offering excellent airflow through side and bottom intakes. Learn more at the link in the description below. So for the thing we're suspicious about, AMD only sampled the media for the 7950X3D. Anyone who has different ones today got it somewhere else. That normally, it's a little bit of an alarm bell. We don't mind paying for our own parts. It's normally the thing that raises question is the choice of what was excluded, because typically the one that's excluded will either make the one that was sent look bad or itself will look bad. So AMD didn't send out the 7900X3D. It's fine, we're gonna buy one, we'll review it just like all the others. But the 7800X3D is the one that we're a little more curious about because it's pushed back into April. After the results we got today, we're thinking maybe it will be extremely competitive with the 7950X3D and they don't want to cannibalize sales. Now, it's possible we're completely wrong about that, but at least as far as gaming, it's probably accurate based on what we know now. Production, totally different story. It's 2 times the cores on the 7950, so it's going to outperform anyway, regardless of the cache arrangement. But if you're buying one for gaming, we just wanted to let you know up front, hey, it might be worth waiting until April and seeing where that one falls. You might be able to save a lot of money if that's what you're interested in. It's more of a 5800X3D replacement in that regard. And when I was talking with the team about the 7950X3D's pricing, Jeremy said it excellently. He said it feels like AMD is going, let's see who will spend $700 before they launch the others. Here's how it all looks. The 7950X3D has 3 chiplets. There's 1 I/O die, there are 2 core dies or CCDs, there's 16 total cores and 32 threads, just like a regular 7950. The big difference is the addition of that 3D V-cache, and that gives the 7950X3D a total of 128 megabytes of L3 cache across the whole CPU. So that's double the amount of the standard 7950X. AMD confirmed with Gamers Nexus that the left CCD, oriented with the I/O die at the bottom, is always the one with the V-cache. That should mean that games and applications that benefited from the increased cache of the last gen 5800X3D will exhibit the same behavior here, but there's a potential snag this time. Since only one of the 2 CCDs has the extra cache, that means that the one with the extra cache, the left CCD, will run at a lower frequency than the unit without the extra cache. And that means that there's potential for worse performance in some situations than a 7950X, or if you configure it incorrectly, which is really easy to do. This complication is something AMD has been working with Microsoft on to help build mechanisms to control for games and Windows. In a conversation with AMD, we learned that the cores on the rightmost CCD can still of course, access the L3 cache that is located physically on top of the left CCD, but as you would expect, there's a latency penalty because now you're traveling cross-channel, basically across the fabric link to the first CCD with the cache. So there's a latency hit, which is suboptimal, and that's also something AMD is working with Microsoft on, but they've also built some optimizers that you can install, and you should. Otherwise, you're going to have worse performance than expected. Additionally, we asked if there's a particular selection process for which CCD or which chiplet gets the cache, and AMD said this. Although we don't comment specifically on binning, I can say that the criteria that would be a top binned Vcache die may not always be the same as a top binned standard die. It would not be an accurate assumption that slow dies become Vcache CCDs and fast dies become standard CCDs, since they may not have the same criteria for evaluating these statements. So that's really helpful. Now, another big change here is the thermal design and the power. When the 7950X first launched, one of the biggest difference between it and the previous CPUs is that it would boost to TJ Max, so it would run right up until 95 degrees Celsius. It would boost contingent on the cooler that you use, and that has changed this time, as has the TDP. We're going to move the explanation of that after the charts, though, so we can get to the charts faster, because we know that's what you're all interested in. So, getting into that, the 7950X3D was actually one of the most complicated test setups we had to configure in recent memory. The usual notes apply, of course, for you all, where it's just be sure to install the latest chipset drivers. It really matters here. And be sure to install the latest BIOS, especially if you're buying your launch. That matters a lot. It may work without it, but it will work better with the latest BIOS. So the things in the chipset you need to install include AMD PPM and AMD Performance Optimizer. These are new, and they are only available for X3D CPUs. Your CPU will not work right without these. And here's an example why it wouldn't work right. To demonstrate the core parking behavior, we ran hardware info logging for core utilization during Total War Warhammer 3. This chart illustrates it well. We're seeing the first 17 threads get loaded to at least 37%, with descending utilization once we're past the first few cores. Core 0, thread 0 gets the most load. Then core 1, thread 0, which is listed as thread 2 on this chart. Threads 18 to 31, which includes their host cores, are doing nothing. They're parked. Running them actually worsens the performance in a lot of these games. So it's a callback to AMD's old game mode behavior, except it doesn't turn the cores off when doing a task that isn't identified as a game by Xbox Game Bar. So production applications get all the cores, and this behavior is important if you want to maximize the CPU. Our next chart is between the 7950X3D with the two new optimizer features specific to X3D and the most recent pre-launch driver that was lacking them. This chart shows a simple A-B comparison with a 100% baseline performance for the prior driver. The red line shows the new driver and the optimizers, which are considered stock performance, and any lead is shown as over 100%. This shows why it's important to install the driver and utilize those features if you're going to be gaming on the X3D CPUs, because it helps assign priority and scheduling. Now, you should always be installing chipset drivers with a brand new machine anyway, but specifically make sure those two by default checked options are in fact checked. The Tomb Raider result increased by 35% just by going to the appropriate driver for this CPU and getting off the older one, with F1 at 31% improved, Final Fantasy at 28% improved, and so on. It's clear that there's an advantage. Now, the reason we include this is because it would be really easy to lose a ton of performance and not know why as an end user if you just download some driver package for the chipset and you don't realize that the newest one actually does contain differences. So we're just trying to help you all be aware of how to set these up to get the most out of them. This also applies to production applications. You can see that in this chart. There's no point belaboring it, but it's clearly beneficial, and it's just not as important as it is in the games. Those are the first two charts. We have a big explanation for how this works. It is actually really interesting on a technology level. We're going to put that at the back of the review because we know everybody just wants to see numbers. So we're going to get into the competitive charts right now and then stick around or at least jump ahead to learn about how all this core parking behavior works. So it's really cool. Okay, game charts. We're putting Far Cry 6 up front because it's the second most interesting result. The most interesting result is next. This game in particular showed strong performance on the 58X3D back when we reviewed the first 3D Vcache CPU, and we expect to see the same here. That doesn't mean the behavior scales to every other game, but at least shows the upper bound of Vcache's capabilities. Getting to the chart, the 7950X3D ran at 198 FPS average with lows proportionally spaced at 145 FPS for 1% and 120 for 0.1%. This is a moderate victory for the X3D because it shows real scaling against the 7950X Normal Edition. It's our new name for it. The gain is 15% here, moving from 172 FPS to 198 FPS average. We already talked about the older chipset driver tests, But just to put it into more context, we can see that the driver without performance optimizations is actually slower than even a 7700X, and it places closer to a 7600X. The 7950X3D's performance allows AMD to break ahead of Intel for the first time since the 5800X3D in this game chart. The 58X3D itself is still faster than all of the other AMD parts on this benchmark, even a couple frames ahead of the 7950X9 3D. The new X3D position is roughly tied with Intel, with neither Intel nor AMD holding a meaningful advantage over the other in any of our three measurements, average 1% or 0.1%. Just quickly, and as an older reference, prior 16-core CPUs ran at 138 FPS average for the 5950X and 111 for the 3950X, or 43% and 79% gains to the new X3D respectively. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next. This one is the most interesting, primarily because the X3D performance here is absolutely insane. The 5800X3D was already impressive with its 332 FPS average results, leading even the well-performing 13900K by an embarrassing 9%. The 7950X3D rubs salt even deeper into those wounds, climbing to a massive 383 FPS average for a staggering 26% lead over the 13900K. That's about the same when compared to the 7950X non-3D, where we're seeing a 25% improvement just for that Vcache addition. X3D performance is remarkable in this game. It won't always be like this, clearly. This is the standout chart in this review. But there's something satisfying about seeing new technology prove to be more than just a keynote point to impress investors who don't know anything and haven't played a game since Pac-Man. The 13900K is obviously still a good part, and price clearly doesn't favor the 7950X3D when speaking generally, just in terms of value. But AMD gets some leeway when it can establish itself as a best on a chart, just like Intel does when it does the same. We're suspicious of the 78X3D possibly embarrassing AMD's own 7950X3D, but we'll find out for that one in April. As for the 58X3D, that's still the best value on this chart, assuming you can still find one, especially if it's still in the 300s. Just quickly comparing to other parts, the 7950X3D leads the 5950X by 150 FPS average generationally, or about 60%, and the improvement over the 3950X is about 125%. Final Fantasy XIV is up now, tested with the Endwalker expansion and using the benchmark tool for more consistency. The 7950X3D isn't a chart leader here, but it does get closer than before. If you take a zoomed out look at this chart, you'll notice that Intel was previously uninterrupted in its dominance for almost the top half of this chart. We'll just highlight all of them to make it easy. It had a substantial lead, a result of this game in particular having strong performance and affinity for Intel CPUs. The 7950X3D breaks out of the box that AMD was previously placed in, which capped at about 230 FPS before, and it now ties with the 13600K. Unfortunately, its 0.1% lows drop down significantly from the 13600K, and the value is obviously not good in this instance anyway. The improvement over the non-3D is at least 20%, so it is working. Just testing the technology alone, that's a big jump, and that's important. And the 58X3D previously showed similar advantages, which you can still see here. But Intel takes the lead in this one, and AMD's frame time performance isn't as consistent as Intel's here. Smoothing out those 1% and 0.1% lows would further bolster AMD's average and push it higher, even if it's at the cost of some of the peaks. And now we get into some scenarios where the 7950X3D isn't that impressive. In Counter-Strike Go, the 13900K leads the charts with a 427 FPS average. The 7950X follows that at 419 FPS average, and the 7950X3D has a few entries here. We've added one set of 4 test passes with the Prefer Frequency BIOS setting enabled, then the stock result, and then we have the old driver result. While preferred frequency did boost the average frame rate from 384 to 409, so it looks like it's working, that's a 7% increase after all, it actually worsened the lows massively by hurting the frame time consistency. It dropped to 94 FPS 0.1% from 166 previously. So if you're using the prefer frequency setting, just be careful that if you only look at average FPS when you do a quick comparison, it may be misleading you and not telling you the full story. Ultimately, the non-X3D is 9% ahead of the stock X3D's 384 FPS average anyway, and the 13900K, 7700X, and 13700K all offer better value. Vcache doesn't always win. Sometimes it's actually regressive in performance. And that's for the reasons we said earlier, where it's not necessarily the Vcache itself, but rather how they are restructuring the CPU around the Vcache in order to accommodate it. 1440p produces largely the same results. The test is CPU bound, so although there's some shuffling, there's no real change between the two datasets. We just wanted to present it in case you were wondering about a higher resolution. Rainbow Six Siege is up now, another super high FPS. This high FPS has the FPS at about 858 FPS for the 13900K, an effing high FPS. The 7950X3D is next at 841 average FPS, allowing the 13900K's FPS a 2% lead in average FPS in this FPS game. It's obviously completely unacceptable to forfeit 17.3 FPS average to the 13900K here, because it renders the game totally unplayable. If you didn't suck already, you will now. If the X3D had sacrificed only 17.1 FPS, or nay, even 17.2 FPS, it'd be fine. But 17.3 crosses that line. The 7950X3D leads the non-3D by 2%, unexcitingly, and the lead over the 5950X is 23%, with the 3950X gapped at 76%. Ultimately, tying the 13700K isn't impressive, nor is the 10% lead over the 5800X3D, so let's move on from talking about FPS to this FPS with things that have effing high FPS. Cyberpunk 2077 is next, tested at 1080p and with custom settings that lean towards medium. This game is still GPU intensive enough that it gives us a perspective for how much a CPU can possibly matter for gaming. Ultimately here, if you're not on a 4090, a lot of these high-end differences won't be visible, or at least they'll be minimized at the very top end. Cyberpunk still scales, but there are clear divisions in that scaling. The 7950X3D leads the chart with its 268 FPS average, although 0.1% lows dip when compared to the 13900K, but not in a way that's relevant. And to be fair, the average FPS lead is also not particularly relevant when we're talking 3 to 4 FPS. Also, FPS I still have semantic satiation for after the last chart. The 7950X's 231 FPS average allows the X3D a more meaningful lead of 16%. Vcache is still doing what it's supposed to do, just like we saw in the 58X3D with its tie-in of the 7900X. You can see that the other 5000 series chips we tested got stuck at around 190 FPS instead, so the performance improvement is consistent with Vcache. The X3D's value isn't good here, but at least it's provable in terms of uplift. The 13600K is probably the most sensible of the top 4 performers. F1 2022 is up now. In this one, we're testing at 1080p and with high settings. The 7950X3D's 513 FPS average carried with it proportionally scaled lows at 274 and 238. That ranks it 12% ahead of the 13900K and its 460 FPS average result. The improvement over the non-3D 7950X is 20% here, with the lead over the 5800X3D at 21%. For an older comparison, the 5950X gives up a 52% improvement, with the 3950X getting doubled by the new X3D. Finally, our Total War Warhammer 3 benchmark is last for games. We'll look at power and production next. The 13900K leads with the 360 FPS average result that you see here, followed next by the 13700K. The 7950X3D shows up in third at 304 FPS average, with not meaningfully lower 0.1% lows. Compared to the non-X3D, we're seeing a gain of 10%. It's not massive, but it's not bad either. It's certainly better than we saw in CSGO. Intel still ultimately wins this one, and the 13600K once again proves that it's very good value for something that nearly behaves exactly like one of these high-end CPUs. Power consumption testing is up now. For this, we look at just 100% all-core workloads as a worst-case scenario. This isn't the same as when you're gaming, because typically there's more shared work between the GPU and the CPU and other components, which means that the CPU is lower power consuming in those scenarios. The 7950X originally pulled 263 watts at the EPS 12-volt cables with BIOS version 0705, which is the newer of the two that we tested for power consumption for the 7950X. There's a newer one still for the X3D. The original launch day test had it at 251 watts with the launch day BIOS. The 7950X3D pulled 156 watts on the same motherboard when stock, with an interesting behavior with the older chipset driver that had it at 136 watts. It's clearly being underutilized there, with the older driver and the performance matched, so it's not like it got less efficient with the appropriate driver version. Compared to Intel's 295 watts, the 7950X looks efficient in an all-core 100% Blender workload, and now we can look at an efficiency chart to see that. Performance per watt efficiency is up here. This chart is just math. It's a watt-hours equation when factoring in both the time required to complete a task and the energy consumption during that task. The 7950X's original entry had it at 26 watt-hours, and the 7950X3D is at 16.5 watt-hours here. Minimally, it's a lot more efficient in general. It's consuming less power than the 7950X to do this work, despite a score that's not much different. That'll be one of the primary advantages of the X3D for production benchmarks in our testing, since it's uncommon for cache to benefit performance in the workstation applications we use here. However, part of this could be silicon fitness or quality, where not only has more time passed since the original came out, but they may also be binning differently to allow for lower operating voltages, or V-core mostly, which would allow this reduced power consumption. Our first production benchmarks start with Blender, which is also what we used for our efficiency calculation a moment ago. Blender is a 3D modeling and animation tool. We use it internally for even 2D product designs, and we render an animation of this using Cycles Renderer on the CPU. The 7950X leads the chart with a 6-minute render, followed next by the X3D at 6.3 minutes. They're about the same, although there's technically a slight and repeatable lead for the 7950X. That's expected behavior here. The 13900K is next, where the 7950X3D leads by 4%. After this, we run across the 5950X, the prior flagship, at 9 minutes, and that gives the X3D a 32% advantage, or really the non-X3D as well, because they're about the same. Compiling a codebase is up next. We can't account for all compiler behavior. Compilers in particular, we've seen behave very differently between different operating systems and use cases. So this is just representative of a heavier Chromium full compile benchmark. The compile required 37.5 minutes on the 7950X non-3D variant, with the 3D option slowing down to 38.7 minutes. That makes the non-3D CPU about 3% faster. The 13900K, meanwhile, currently leads both of AMD's flagships at a time reduction of 4%, at least versus the 7950X, or 8% time reduction, meaning it's faster than the 7950X3D. Against last generation, the 7950X3D outperforms the 5950X by 28%, with the non-3D obviously faster still. In file compression testing, we measure in millions of instructions per second, and then we rank highest to lowest. The 7950X3D did the best here, at 200,000 MIPS. That puts it about 1.3% ahead of the 7950X non-3D, so they're basically the same, and it's 4% ahead of the 13900K. Thus far, you wouldn't buy the 3D variant for these tests unless you also do a lot of gaming. Decompression is where AMD really takes off on a tear. In this instance, the 7950X led at 270,000 MIPS. That's 3% ahead of the X3D, which itself is about 21% ahead of the 5950X and 38% ahead of the 3950X. Adobe Premiere testing is next. We use Puget Suite for this, testing compiles, transforms, filters, renders, playback, scrubbing, and more. The 13900K leads everyone with an aggregate score of 1332 points. Looking one rank down, that lead is relegated to more of a tie, as the 7950X non-3D is just 2 points behind. The X3D variant ran at 1307 points, giving the 7950X a 2% lead. Below this, the 7900X sits at 1254 points, with the 5950X allowing the 7950X3D a 15% lead, or about 21% when you compare against the 3950X. As an aside, we just recently switched away from AMD entirely for our Premiere machines. We were on a Threadripper system previously, but the current Premiere version just leverages the IGP so much for Intel that, at least for our types of videos specifically, which are chart heavy, we had to make the move back to Intel because the IGP was accelerating it in a really beneficial way for us. Adobe Photoshop is last for our production benchmarks. This one has the 13900K at 1741 points, allowing it a significant lead of 14% against the 7950X3D. The 7950X's 1580 point score has it ahead of the X3D at 3.6% advantage, once again showing that the extra cache doesn't help in our production suite. And now it's time to come back to an earlier point about TJ Maxx and power design differences. So previously, 95 degrees Celsius was the thermal target that the 7950X would boost to. Now it's 89 degrees. AMD's official statement says this, quote, TJ Maxx is the max safe operating temperature, not the absolute max temperature. In the Ryzen 7000 series, the processor is designed to run at TJ Maxx 24/7 without risk of damage or deterioration. But they brought it down to 89 because Vcache is very sensitive to heat, so it's a different situation. The power limit is lower as well. The 7950X3D TDP is down from 170 watts on the original to 120 watts for the X3D. And then in our power chart earlier, which we'll bring back now, you'll see that we were running over 120, but it's normal for TDP to not equal actual power consumption. That's because the actual socket power, or the PPT limit, is set to 162 watts out of the box versus 230 on the regular 7950X. All this is important because in heterogeneous CPU design, the computer, or more specifically the OS, needs a way to decide what cores to assign tasks to. Intel has two types of cores in its current mainstream CPUs, but that's an easier thing for the OS to judge since it basically boils down to the fact that they're just slow or fast. That's it. If it's a game or other demanding application, assign it to the P cores and you're done. In AMD's case, with the 7950X3D and the 7900X3D that we'll review later, it's not that simple. In a perfect world, the OS's scheduler would have knowledge of which applications prefer the extra cache over the raw clock speed. But Windows has no way to know that. If a game or application that prefers cache jumps to the other CCD, or vice versa, it'll create performance problems. AMD's workaround for this is to have Windows park the cores on the second, higher clocking CCD, so it's actually disabling the faster cores intentionally when it thinks you're running a game. So you can think of it like a parking lot with parking stalls. It is moving those cores, the last 16, into parking spots so that the rest of the traffic can get through and get those cores out of the way. Because even though they're supposed to help, they actually slow things down if the game can make use of that vcache where it needs to be operating on the CCD with the vcache to avoid that latency hit. Here's where things get a little interesting. So the mechanism for this to work, AMD's Performance Optimizer, is Xbox Game Bar, which comes with Windows these days. So you need to run that, it needs to be updated, and you also need to run the balanced power profile in Windows, not high performance. AMD has historically recommended high performance. For X3D, it's best to run balanced. Otherwise, the cores will not be permitted to park, which will, again, think of it as being in the flow of traffic. They are in the way. And this is also why we think the 7800X3D will become very interesting, because AMD is effectively turning off half of a $700 CPU to run games faster, whereas the 7800X3D shouldn't have to do that. You should just be able to use it because half of a 7950X3D is kind of a 7800X3D already. You just lose all the production performance. And finally, traditional overclocking like voltage and frequency configuration is not permitted, at least not over voltage. And you have to do it all through Curve Optimizer or other means, but we'll maybe talk about that more later if it's interesting. So wrapping this up then, generally speaking, the 7950X3D has been really impressive in gaming workloads, especially or primarily if you turn half of the CPU off, specifically half of the cores, but you leave the cache on. Now, this is not an active thing. You don't have to go through anymore and toggle game mode and not game mode. It used to work that way. It's not how it works now. So if it's been a while, it is now automatic, which is good, as long as you install the latest BIOS and chipset drivers, which we already talked about in the beginning. So the problem comes when you look at it being $700. As a technological feat, this is really impressive. The vcache is working properly when the games can actually leverage it. So in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, where we're seeing 25% differences, that's insane, considering nothing else really has changed, except the frequency a little bit. And then for Final Fantasy, we saw reasonable gains as well. For Total War, Warhammer 3, we saw pretty good gains. So we're in the 10 to 15% range for about half the games. Tomb Raider is an outlier, but really impressive. And then some of the others are worse, which is expected behavior. It just depends on what the game specifically would benefit from. And we tested prefer faster core with Counter-Strike, if you want to go back and check that chart. For production applications, this doesn't make sense. In any of the ones we test, there's probably something out there that can really leverage the cache. So for example, years ago, we had a compile benchmark before we moved to Chromium, or it was a different Chromium maybe, where we had inadvertently accidentally created a cache benchmark. And the way the benchmark worked was the numbers on the bar would have been in the same order if we literally sorted the data by most cache. So it wasn't really, we ended up getting rid of it as a benchmark for a lot of reasons we described in an old video. But if you can find a real world scenario like that, then yeah, it'll be useful in your production work. Our standard suite does not include one. So for our production tests, for what we looked at, this is not any better than a 7950X. And of course, in a lot of cases, you should look at the 3900K as well, because it's better in a good amount of these tests, or at least close enough. So in gaming, the big thing to remember is that we think the 7800X3D would have usurped the 7950X3D, except AMD has reduced its frequency hard by 700 megahertz, and you won't be able to overclock it through any official means. So that creates the product segmentation they're looking for. That leaves the 7900X3D, which is close enough in frequency that it could be just as good, and it's no wonder AMD didn't sample it, but it'll depend on that CCD layout and how they split the 12 cores. It may be worth just waiting to see, but if you need to build now or whatever, you just want the best, this is doing what it's supposed to do in gaming. So other CPUs to look at and consider, we're seeing 4% better at best in production workloads versus 7950X, so you should just look at the 7950X if you're a workstation type user. If you're a gaming user, look at the 13900K, the 13600K, and the 7950X3D. And of course, the 5800X3D is still really impressive in a lot of these charts. In fact, in the places where the 7950X3D punched above where it made sense for AMD to otherwise be, the 58X3D was right there next to it. And for the same reason, they both have this massive amount of cache. So our recommendation to you, if you are more value-oriented, but you're still at the high end, then the 13600K makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like a poser high-end CPU for gaming, where if you put them next to each other, like actual gameplay footage, you can't most of the time see too much of a difference between a 13.6, 13.9, 7950X3D, depending on what kind of games you're playing. If you're less price sensitive, then the 7950X3D is dominant in a lot of these charts, with some exceptions giving way to the 13900K. And then if you're in the budget class, you should look at our 13100F review, where we talk about the 12100F as the best option for you. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more and go to store.gamersaccess.net to support our deep dives like this one with in-depth testing and discussion for reviews. And thanks for watching, and we'll see you all next time.